Her name was Diane Whitfield, born in 1968 in a small town on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. The house she grew up in had a moss green roof, a backyard big enough for a wooden swing set that had faded with years of sun and rain, and a black and white television that was always turned on every evening at 6 o'clock, right when her father walked through the door after another shift at the steel mill where he worked for 22 years. Diane couldn't say exactly when she first heard the words nuclear war. It didn't arrive as a shock. It settled into her life the way ordinary facts do, the way a child simply comes to know that a red light means stop. At her elementary school, once a month, sometimes more, her teacher would stand up in the middle of a lesson, tap the chalkboard gently, and say one short phrase. "Okay, everyone, get down." And the whole class, without needing further explanation, would slide under their desks, wrap their arms over their heads, and stay completely silent until they were told it was safe to sit back up. None of the kids in that classroom fully understood what exactly they were preparing for, but every one of them understood something deeper. This wasn't a game. Somewhere out there, something large and dangerous existed. Large enough that adults felt it necessary to train children how to protect themselves from it. In the evenings, while Diane sat down to dinner with her family, the television in the living room stayed on, and the newscaster's voice regularly worked its way through phrases an 8-year-old couldn't fully grasp, but still absorbed completely. Nuclear warheads, the arms race, the growing tension with the Soviet Union. Her father, a quiet man by nature, would usually just shake his head slightly at those segments. Her mother would tighten her grip around her napkin, as if she were holding something together that threatened to come apart. No one in that house ever sat Diane down and explained in plain words that the world could end at any moment. But she learned it anyway. The way children always learn the most important lessons, not through explanation, but through atmosphere. Through the way adults' faces changed. Through the heavy silence that settled over the room every time the evening news came on. If this story is already starting to feel familiar, take a moment to subscribe to Labyrinth Psychology. This is a space where we step into the labyrinth inside every human mind, not to get lost in it, but to understand why we became who we are today. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. When Diane turned 10, the energy crisis swept across the country. She remembers, in vivid detail, her father waiting in long lines at the gas station, sometimes starting before sunrise, just to make sure there was enough fuel to get to work for the week. She remembers dinners lit by candlelight, not for romance, but because of the town-wide energy conservation orders. She remembers the low hum of anxiety running underneath every adult conversation, an unnamed worry that something happening far away was somehow reaching into their ordinary lives in Ohio. Those years taught Diane a lesson she didn't consciously recognize at the time, but one that would follow her for the rest of her life. The world is not stable, and stability, when it exists at all, is temporary. Anything could change without warning. Fuel could run out. Peace could collapse. An ordinary evening could turn, without notice, into a survival drill. By the time Diane reached middle school, she began to notice something different about herself compared to the other kids in her class. While many of her classmates talked freely about small, carefree things, Diane had developed a habit of preparing in advance for almost everything. She always carried loose change in her pocket in case she needed to use a payphone. She always knew more than one way home in case a road was ever blocked. She never let a water bottle sit completely empty. Her friends sometimes teased her, calling her the warrior of the group. But Diane herself didn't fully understand why she did these things. She only knew that it made her feel a little safer, as if preparing for the worst possible outcome was the one thing that could keep her from ever being caught off guard. When Diane was 16, her parents divorced. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It happened quietly, almost in a whisper, in a way that matched exactly how both of her parents had always handled big emotions, by keeping them contained. One evening, her mother sat down on the edge of her bed and told her, in a calm and measured voice, that her father would be moving into a different apartment and that everything was going to be fine. Diane nodded. She said she understood and turned back to the book she'd been reading. She didn't cry in front of her mother. She waited until she was alone, sat in the bathroom with the faucet running loudly enough that no one could hear, and let herself fall apart there, quietly, where no one could see. After that, Diane's daily life shifted in very concrete ways. Her mother had to take on 2 jobs to cover expenses, which meant Diane usually came home from school to an empty house, letting herself in with the key she wore on a string around her neck, warming up her own dinner, finishing her homework with no one to check it, and comforting herself through the loneliness of an empty house on her own. She learned to become an adult in a way no child should have to learn so young. Not because anyone forced her to, but because the circumstances simply left no other option. She learned to calm herself down when she was scared. She learned to solve problems without anyone to turn to. She learned to make decisions without anyone there to ask. By the time Diane turned 20, she left the small town where she'd grown up and moved to a bigger city, taking an office job at an insurance company. She worked hard, saved carefully, and always kept an emergency fund that she never touched, even during months when money was tight. Her coworkers sometimes couldn't understand why someone so young was so cautious. But for Diane, this wasn't a conscious act of caution. It was a reflex, built years earlier, from a child standing in a gas line beside her father, or crouched under a school desk during a drill she didn't fully understand. When Diane turned 38, the 2008 financial crisis hit. Many people around her panicked. Some lost their jobs. Some lost their homes. But Diane, though seriously affected herself, became the person everyone around her noticed for staying remarkably calm. She didn't spiral. She immediately made a plan, cut back her spending, found additional sources of income, and quietly worked her way through that period without needing much reassurance from anyone. Later, when someone asked her how she managed to stay so composed during such a massive crisis, Diane just smiled and said she'd learned to prepare for the worst back when she was still a child. She didn't elaborate much further because to her, it wasn't a remarkable story worth telling in detail. It was simply how she had always lived. There was one evening when Diane was 55, her daughter, a young woman from a completely different generation, asked her a very simple question. "Mom, have you ever actually felt safe?" Diane was quiet for a long moment before answering. She looked out the window, watching the streetlights slowly flicker on as the evening darkened, and said she wasn't sure she'd ever known what absolute safety felt like. She said she grew up in a world where instability was simply the norm, where people learned to live alongside worry instead of waiting for it to disappear. But she also added something else. Precisely because she had learned to live with that uncertainty from such a young age, she had become someone who could stay standing through almost anything life threw at her. She didn't fall apart when her company went through layoffs. She didn't panic when the stock market crashed. She didn't lose her footing when her first marriage ended in heartbreak. Because somewhere deep inside, she had always carried a quiet belief that no matter what happened, she would find a way to survive it. Diane's story isn't the story of just one person. It's the story of millions of children who grew up during the same slice of history, carrying the same kind of collective memory. Classroom drills, blackout nights, quiet divorces, and an underlying dread that the world could collapse without warning. What stands out isn't that they were afraid. Everyone is afraid at some point in their lives. What stands out is how they transformed that fear into a quiet form of strength. The ability to prepare, the ability to endure, the ability to stay standing when everything around them turned uncertain. No one deliberately taught them how to do this. They simply grew up in an environment that forced them to teach themselves. And over time, that lesson became inseparable from who they were. If you recognize a piece of Diane in yourself, maybe you also grew up carrying a low, quiet worry that no one ever gave a name to. Maybe it wasn't the fear of nuclear war. Maybe it was the fear of losing stability, the fear of being left alone, or simply an unease you never fully understood the source of. What matters isn't pinpointing exactly where that fear came from. What matters is recognizing that, like Diane, you may have already turned that fear into a form of strength you've never named out loud. The ability to prepare, the ability to endure, the ability to stay standing when no one else can. And maybe the most worthwhile thing to sit with isn't how afraid you once were, but how you learned to keep going anyway, even when that fear never fully disappeared.
By her late 20s, Diane had built a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. She rented a small apartment above a hardware store, drove a used sedan she'd paid for in cash, and kept a steady rhythm to her days that rarely wavered. But underneath that ordinary surface, there was a pattern she hadn't fully named yet. A pattern that would come to define much of her adult life. She struggled to ask for help, not because she didn't need it, but because asking felt, to her, like admitting a kind of weakness she'd trained herself never to show. When her car broke down on a rainy October night, she didn't call a friend. She sat in the driver's seat, worked through the problem methodically, found a payphone 2 blocks away, and arranged a tow truck herself, all without waking anyone up or asking a single person to come sit with her while she waited. It wasn't stubbornness in the way people often assume. It was something quieter and older than that, a belief planted decades earlier that leaning on someone else came with a risk. The risk of being let down, the risk of becoming a burden, the risk of discovering that the person you called wouldn't show up, the way so many promises from childhood simply hadn't. Diane's first real relationship came in her mid-20s with a man named Robert, a mechanic she met through a mutual friend at a backyard barbecue. Robert was warm in a way Diane wasn't used to. He asked questions. He noticed when something was bothering her before she said a word. And for the first several months, Diane found this both comforting and, at times, deeply unsettling. She wasn't used to being seen that closely. She'd spent so many years learning to manage her emotions privately, quietly, without an audience, that having someone actively pay attention to her inner world felt almost like being caught doing something she shouldn't. There was a night, about a year into the relationship, when Robert asked her directly what she was afraid of, not in a confrontational way, gently, the way someone asks a question they already suspect matters. Diane remembers sitting across from him at a small kitchen table, turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands, and realizing she didn't actually have an answer ready. Not because she didn't have fears, because she had never been asked to name them out loud before. She eventually told him a fraction of the truth, that she worried constantly about things falling apart, that she always kept a mental list of backup plans, that she found it hard to relax even when nothing was wrong. Robert listened, without trying to fix it, which surprised her more than anything he could have said. It was the first time in her adult life someone had simply let her fear exist in the room without rushing to explain it away. That relationship eventually ended, not out of conflict, but out of a slow drifting apart that neither of them fully understood at the time. Years later, Diane would describe it not as a failure, but as the first place she ever practiced letting someone in, even briefly, even imperfectly. If you're finding pieces of your own story inside Diane's, take a moment to subscribe to Labyrinth Psychology. This is where we continue exploring the quiet, often unspoken psychology behind who we become, not to label it, but to understand it. Turn on notifications so the next chapter doesn't pass you by. Diane's career unfolded slowly, without dramatic turning points, in the way most real careers actually do. She moved from an entry-level claims position to a supervisory role over the course of 11 years, earning each promotion through a reputation for being dependable in situations where other people tended to unravel. When a major storm caused an unprecedented surge of insurance claims one summer, overwhelming the entire department, it was Diane who stayed late without being asked, who created a system to prioritize the most urgent cases, who never once raised her voice even as phones rang non-stop for weeks. Her manager later told her she had a rare kind of composure under pressure. Diane accepted the compliment, but privately, she understood something her manager didn't. This wasn't composure that appeared out of nowhere. It was composure built years earlier, one gas line and one air raid drill at a time. There was, however, a cost to this steadiness that took Diane much longer to recognize. Because she rarely showed strain, people around her rarely thought to check on her. She became, in almost every environment she entered, the person others leaned on. A coworker who covered shifts, a neighbor who watched pets during emergencies, a friend who showed up with casseroles after funerals. But when Diane herself was struggling, very few people thought to ask, because she had spent so long training everyone around her to believe she never needed to be asked. In her early 40s, Diane met David, a widower with 2 teenage children, at a community fundraiser for the local library. Their relationship developed slowly, cautiously, shaped as much by Diane's instinct toward self-protection as by genuine affection. She remembers, early in their courtship, quietly running financial and emotional worst-case scenarios in her mind before allowing herself to get attached, a habit she recognized, even as she was doing it, as something inherited from a childhood spent bracing for instability. They married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in David's backyard, with folding chairs borrowed from the church and a cake made by Diane's mother, who had, by then, softened considerably with age. Diane became a stepmother almost overnight, a role she approached with the same quiet diligence she brought to everything else in her life, showing up consistently, staying calm during teenage crises, never demanding recognition for the invisible labor she took on. It was during this period of her life, watching David's children navigate a completely different world than the one she'd grown up in, a world of instant communication, constant connectivity, and, in many ways, far less unstructured fear, that Diane began to reflect more deeply on her own upbringing. She noticed that David's kids rarely worried about the things that had shaped her own childhood. They didn't lie awake wondering if the world might end without warning. But she also noticed something else. They seemed to struggle, in ways she hadn't, with uncertainty of any kind. A delayed response to a text message could send one of them into visible distress. A minor disappointment could feel, to them, disproportionately catastrophic. Diane didn't judge this. If anything, it made her more curious about her own resilience, where exactly it had come from, and what, if anything, had been lost along with it. The 2008 financial crisis, which struck when Diane was 40, tested her in ways few events had since childhood. David's small contracting business lost nearly 60% of its clients within 8 months. Diane's own department at the insurance company underwent a painful round of layoffs, one that she narrowly survived, watching colleagues she'd worked alongside for over a decade clean out their desks in cardboard boxes. She remembers coming home one evening during that period, sitting at the kitchen table with David, both of them staring at a stack of bills neither could fully cover that month. David, visibly shaken, asked her how she was staying so calm. Diane thought for a long moment before answering. She told him that this wasn't the first time she'd watched the ground shift beneath her feet without warning. She told him about the gas lines, about the candlelit dinners during the energy crisis, about lying under a school desk as a child, genuinely unsure whether the drill that day was practice or something real. She told him that somewhere along the way, she had learned that panic didn't solve anything, but a plan, even an imperfect one, always gave you somewhere to put your hands. They made it through that year by selling a car, taking in a boarder for 8 months, and Diane picking up freelance bookkeeping work on weekends. It wasn't easy, and there were nights she cried alone in the shower, letting the water mask the sound the same way she had as a teenager. But they made it through, and years later, Diane would describe that period not as her hardest, but as one more confirmation of something she'd suspected about herself since childhood. She was built to withstand collapse, even when it came without warning. By the time Diane reached her late 50s, both of her parents had passed away, within 18 months of each other. Her father died first, quietly, in his sleep, the same understated way he'd lived most of his life. Her mother followed not long after, and Diane often wondered, without ever saying it out loud to anyone, whether grief itself had simply been too heavy a weight for her mother to carry alone after so many decades of carrying everything silently. Sorting through her parents' belongings after the funerals, Diane found something she hadn't expected, a small metal box tucked into the back of her father's closet, containing an outdated but carefully maintained emergency kit, a battery-powered radio, bottled water long past its expiration date, a folded map with several routes out of town marked in faded pencil, a pamphlet from the early 1960s titled, in bold black letters, Family Fallout Shelter. Diane sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom for a long time, holding that pamphlet, finally understanding something about her father she had never fully grasped while he was alive. He hadn't been a naturally anxious man. He had simply lived through a period in history that demanded constant, quiet preparation, and he had carried that instinct with him for the rest of his life, long after the original threat had faded from the headlines. It was, in many ways, the same instinct Diane recognized in herself. And sitting there, she felt, for the first time, something closer to gratitude than resentment toward the fear she'd carried for so long. It hadn't ruined her life. If anything, it had quietly kept her standing through every collapse that came her way. If any part of this is resonating with your own family history, subscribe to Labyrinth Psychology, where we continue tracing the quiet threads connecting who we were as children to who we've become as adults. Turn on notifications so you're here for the next story. Now in her late 50s, Diane began, almost accidentally, to change the way she related to her own vigilance. It started with something small. Her daughter, now an adult herself, invited her on a weekend trip with no fixed itinerary, no backup plan, no predetermined schedule, nothing mapped out in advance. Diane's first instinct was to decline. The idea of unstructured time, without contingencies, made something in her chest tighten in a way she couldn't fully explain. But she went anyway, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed a weekend to unfold, without trying to control every variable in advance. It was uncomfortable at first, almost unbearably so. But by the second day, she noticed something unexpected, a kind of lightness she hadn't experienced in years, the quiet relief of not needing to anticipate every possible outcome before it happened. She didn't abandon her instinct toward preparation entirely, nor did she think she should. That instinct had served her and the people she loved through more crises than she could count. But she began, slowly, to practice distinguishing between the moments that genuinely required vigilance and the moments that simply didn't, a distinction her nervous system had never been given permission to make when she was a child. Diane is 62 now. She still keeps an emergency fund untouched in a separate account. She still knows more than one way home from almost anywhere she frequently drives. She still, on nights when the news covers something unsettling, feels an old, familiar tightening in her chest, one that has never fully disappeared and, she suspects, never entirely will. But she has also learned, later in life than she would have liked, to sit on a porch on an ordinary evening and simply let it be ordinary. To trust, at least some of the time, that the ground beneath her feet will hold without needing a contingency plan close at hand. When her granddaughter, 7 years old, asked her recently what the strangest thing about being a kid a long time ago was, Diane thought about it for a while before answering. She didn't mention war, or fear, or the drills, or the gas lines. She simply said that grown-ups back then worried about a lot of things they never talked about out loud, and that she hoped her granddaughter would always feel safe enough to say her worries out loud instead. Diane's story, in the end, isn't really about the Cold War, or the energy crisis, or any single historical event. It's about what happens to a person's inner world when instability becomes the backdrop of childhood, and how that instability, instead of breaking them, can quietly become the architecture of an unusually resilient life. It's a story that belongs, in its broad strokes, to an entire generation who learned early that the world offers no guarantees, and who built, out of that lesson, a durability that carried them through decades of uncertainty that followed. If you see pieces of Diane, or your own parents, or even yourself in this story, perhaps the most meaningful thing you can take from it isn't a lesson about fear. It's a recognition of what fear, when carried long enough and understood deeply enough, can eventually become not a weakness passed down through generations, but a quiet, steady form of strength that so many people have never had the words to name.